Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I found a dark web Halloween challenge. They're offering $10,000 if I survive until morning. So, I guess I'll start by saying I'm not someone who scares easily. I'm one of those people who loves true crime documentaries, those messed up YouTube rabbit holes about creepy stuff found in the woods, and yes, horror games that make most people check their closets afterward. I guess that's what made this whole thing seem like a good idea at the time. I was browsing some sketchy forums late one night, half out of boredom and half because the idea of finding something truly messed up was just exciting, I guess. My buddies and I have this little game where we send each other these dark web dares and see who actually has the guts to go through with them. But this one was different. I didn't find this one by a dare. It found me. It started as a message in this obscure chat room I'd been lurking in, one of those places where people share weird, low-res screenshots of what they claim to be hidden pages of the internet, forbidden websites that were supposed to be impossible to find without an invitation. And, well, it felt like a Halloween coincidence or something, because the message popped up exactly at midnight. I clicked on it, expecting some lame jump scare or a prank from one of my friends, but it was just a black screen with red text that read, "Congratulations, you've been chosen for the Halloween Survival Challenge, $10,000 if you last until dawn." I remember laughing out loud. 10 grand for a night. Yeah, right. But at the bottom, there was a link. And even though I knew better, I clicked it. The page took forever to load, and for a second, I considered closing the tab. But when it finally opened, it was weirdly simple. Just a plain black screen with a short set of instructions in that same red font. If you agree to the challenge, you must follow these instructions precisely. Any attempts to leave or call for help will result in instant disqualification. They went on to describe a list of things I'd need to do, starting with going to this specific address on Halloween night. Now, normally I'd be all, "Nope, this is where I bail." But they were promising $10,000. And yeah, okay, maybe it was fake, but even if there was a slight chance of getting that money, I couldn't resist. I messaged a couple of my friends, hoping someone would egg me on, but they either ignored me or sent back one-word responses. By then, it was already late, so I made a mental note to hit them up again the next day. Part of me still thought this was some prank one of them had set up, so I went to bed thinking, alright, Halloween night, here we go. The next day was kinda normal, except my friends were weirdly silent about the whole thing. No one had seen the message I got, and when I described the site, they were all like, "Dude, sounds like you're asking to get murdered." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of wanting to see it through. Plus, a little voice in the back of my head kept nagging me about that prize. I knew it was ridiculous, but $10,000 isn't exactly chump change, right? I spent the day convincing myself it would make a funny story, something I could laugh about later. So, fast forward to Halloween night. I followed the directions, packed a flashlight, some snacks, and my phone. Yeah, they said not to call for help, but I'm not stupid enough to leave it behind. I didn't really tell anyone where I was going, which I know sounds like horror movie mistake 101, but I thought this whole thing would be more embarrassing than dangerous. And honestly, I didn't want to give anyone a reason to tell me I was chickening out. The address was out in the middle of nowhere, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The drive out was creepy as hell. I had my windows down, listening to the silence of the fields and woods, every now and then hearing some random animal noises that were way too close for comfort. My GPS kept glitching too, which just added to the whole "don't go here" vibe. Finally, I arrived. It was just this old, abandoned farmhouse. I mean, it looked like the kind of place that would be in a horror movie. Broken windows, overgrown weeds, and that creepy peeling paint that makes the house look like it's breathing. For a second, I thought about turning back, but then I remembered the website's instructions. You must enter the house before midnight or be disqualified. I parked my car in the weeds, keeping it close enough to the house that I could see it from the doorway, but I left it running just in case. The whole place was dead silent, not even a breeze rustling the trees, which made every creak of the old floorboards under my feet sound like an alarm bell. The smell hit me next. This sour, moldy smell mixed with something like burnt hair. It made me want to gag, but I tried to ignore it. As soon as I stepped inside, my phone buzzed. It was another message from that weird site. I opened it, and it just said, "Welcome to the challenge. Check the kitchen table." I walked through the dark, creaking house until I found the kitchen. Sure enough, there was a single piece of paper on the table under a flickering, dusty light. It was handwritten in the same jagged, scratchy font I'd seen on the website. Rules. You must complete each task as instructed. Failure to follow these rules will result in consequences. Once completed, $10,000 will be wired to your account. Task 1. Sit in the living room and turn off all lights. Wait until you hear the first knock. I remember staring at the paper for a long time, wondering if this was some kind of setup, some stupid prank where a bunch of kids would jump out with cheap Halloween masks. But again, that little voice, the one that loves horror movies and internet mysteries, told me to keep going. And maybe, I'd actually be 10 grand richer by morning. So, I walked into the living room, flicked off my flashlight, and sat down. The room was pitch black, and I could barely make out the shapes of the furniture around me. I sat there, staring into the darkness, my pulse loud in my ears, counting the seconds in my head. Then I heard it. The knock was soft at first, barely a tap, but in the dead silence of that house, it echoed like a gunshot. My whole body tensed. I could feel every hair on my neck stand up, and I sat there, my heart pounding, wondering if it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then it came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. It was coming from the front door. I could almost feel the weight behind it, like whoever was knocking was holding back some kind of restraint. It sounds weird, I know, but that's the only way I can describe it. Whoever was out there wasn't just knocking, they were testing. My first instinct was to run out of there, but the paper had been clear about the rules. I wasn't supposed to leave the living room or turn on any lights until the first knock. Now that it had come, I didn't know what I was supposed to do next. I felt around in the dark for my phone, and sure enough, there was another message waiting for me. Do not open the door. Do not look outside. Wait for the second knock. My hands were shaking as I read it. I wanted to tell myself this was just a dumb prank, but something about the message made me feel like someone was watching. I tried to calm down by reminding myself about the money. 10 grand, I told myself. Just make it through until morning, and it'll all be worth it. But still, the silence was unbearable, like the house itself was waiting. After what felt like hours, there it was again, the second knock. This one was louder, more insistent. 3 sharp, angry pounds on the door, like the person on the other side was getting impatient. I tried to ignore it, but then came a dragging sound, like something heavy was being scraped across the wooden porch. My pulse quickened, and I found myself clutching my phone in one hand and my flashlight in the other, even though I knew turning it on would break the rules. I was starting to feel stupid, sitting there in the dark, waiting for who knows what. But then my phone buzzed again. Go to the hallway. There's a mirror at the end. Stand in front of it, but don't look into it until you hear the 3rd knock. I wanted to laugh. This felt like one of those urban legends about Bloody Mary, or the man in the mirror stories we used to tell at sleepovers. But here's the thing. When you're sitting alone in a pitch-black house, with those weird, deliberate knocks echoing around you, those stories don't seem so funny. I crept out of the living room, keeping my steps as quiet as possible. The hallway was even darker, and the air smelled musty, like no one had been here for decades. At the end, I could make out the shape of a mirror on the wall, its glass clouded over with dust and grime. I stood there in front of it, staring at the wall beside it, refusing to look directly into it. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like a countdown to something I wasn't sure I wanted to see. I kept telling myself this was all just a game, that none of it was real. But the longer I stood there, the more the house felt like it was alive, like it was breathing. Then came the 3rd knock. This one was different. 3 heavy, echoing thuds that rattled the whole house, sending a deep vibration through the floorboards. My throat tightened, and for a second, I thought about bolting. Rules be damned. But I knew if I wanted that prize, I'd have to follow every instruction. I exhaled, steeling myself, and slowly turned to look into the mirror. At first, all I saw was my own reflection. My face, pale and tense, staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. I was relieved, but then I noticed something off. In the background, right behind my shoulder, was a shadowy figure. Just a vague shape, but enough that I could make out a dark hood and the suggestion of a face, twisted into a sneer that seemed too real for a reflection. My heart hammered, and I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there, but the hallway was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, though, the figure was still there. Only now, it was closer. I forced myself to keep looking, even though every instinct told me to run. My mind was racing with thoughts of all the horror stories I'd heard about people who saw something in a mirror and then, well, I didn't want to think about what usually happened next. My phone buzzed again, and I almost dropped it, but I managed to keep my hand steady enough to read the message. Do not look away from the mirror until the figure disappears. I swallowed hard, my eyes glued to the shadowy figure behind me. The longer I looked, the more detailed it became, its features sharpening until I could see the faint outline of eyes. They were hollow, pitch-black pits that seemed to stare straight into me, unblinking, like they were daring me to look away. A part of me felt like I was suffocating, like I couldn't breathe until it was gone, but I forced myself to keep staring, even as the figure grew closer, inch by inch, until it was almost leaning over my shoulder. I could feel an icy coldness seeping into me, like the shadow was somehow touching me, but I kept my gaze locked on it, praying it would just disappear. And finally, it did. 1 second it was there, looming over me, and the next, nothing, just my own reflection again, pale and shaking, staring back at me like I'd just seen a ghost. The relief I felt was intense, like a weight lifting off my shoulders, but it didn't last long. My phone buzzed again, and this time, the message was different. Now, go to the basement. There is something waiting for you. I stood there, frozen. Part of me wanted to turn back, to get in my car and drive as far away from this place as possible. But the thought of leaving without that prize, of giving up after coming this far, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I reminded myself it was all just a game. A sick, twisted game, but nothing more. Taking a deep breath, I made my way to the basement door. It was old and warped, with rusted hinges that creaked loudly as I pulled it open. The smell that drifted up from below was worse than the house's usual moldy stink. It was heavy, like decay mixed with something metallic. My flashlight flickered, but I pointed it down the stairs anyway, hoping for a better look. The staircase was narrow and steep, disappearing into total darkness. With each step, I could feel the cold air wrapping around me, pulling me down into the shadows. At the bottom, I hesitated, letting the darkness settle around me. And then, as I raised my flashlight, I saw it. Something small, lying on the ground in the middle of the room. I stepped closer, my heart pounding harder with each step, until I was close enough to see what it was. A single, black envelope with my name scrawled on it in messy, jagged handwriting. And just as I reached for it, I heard a faint whisper behind me. I froze. The whisper was so faint that I wasn't sure I'd even heard it at first. It was like the sound was part of the cold, heavy air itself, just a breath at the edge of my hearing. But then it came again, soft and unsettlingly close, as if someone were right behind me, leaning in. My flashlight wavered as I turned, but there was nothing there, just darkness pressing in around the dim glow of my light. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, a sensation so intense it was like fingers brushing the back of my neck. Every instinct was screaming for me to leave, to get out of that basement, out of that house, and never look back. But I couldn't just abandon everything now. Not with that black envelope on the floor, with my name written on it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus, and slowly reached down, picking up the envelope with fingers that didn't feel like my own. The paper was thick and rough, like it had been made from scraps, and the writing was so jagged that it almost tore through the page. I didn't want to open it, but the instructions kept replaying in my head. Complete each task. I peeled the envelope open, half expecting something to jump out at me, but it was just a note. Written in that same scratchy handwriting, the message was short. You are being watched. Do not turn around. My blood went cold. Every muscle in my body tensed, and the basement felt like it was closing in, the shadows shifting as though they were alive. I wanted so badly to look, to see if someone or something was behind me, but I forced myself to keep facing forward. My heart was hammering so loud I was afraid it might echo off the walls. There was more written beneath the first line, but it was smeared and faded, like someone had scribbled it in a hurry, then tried to erase it. I squinted, trying to make out the words. Proceed to the living room, find the clock, and wait for it to strike midnight. I didn't need to be told twice. The basement's chill felt like it was creeping into my bones, and I bolted up the stairs, not even bothering to close the basement door behind me. Every step felt like something was just inches behind me, watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, like the shadows themselves were alive and would reach out if I so much as hesitated. Back in the living room, I tried to steady myself, breathing slowly, but it didn't help. My nerves were shot, and I couldn't get that whisper out of my head. There was no clock in sight, but I noticed a faint ticking noise coming from somewhere near the fireplace. I walked over, expecting to see an old-fashioned grandfather clock, or maybe a mantelpiece one, but there was nothing. Just the sound, ticking and ticking, like it was counting down. My phone buzzed. I almost dropped it, my fingers stiff and cold. The message was waiting on the screen. Do not look for the clock. It will find you. I stood there, my heart racing, but the message made no sense. I waited, listening to the ticking, but the room stayed as empty as it had been when I'd entered. My flashlight had started to dim, the batteries barely holding up, and I didn't want to be left in the dark again. I shined it around the room, and that's when I saw it, just a glimmer in the corner of my eye. At the far end of the room, in a shadowy corner where the light barely reached, there was something moving, just a faint, slow sway, like a clock's pendulum swinging back and forth. But there was no clock, just an empty space where the shadows seemed to bend and twist in unnatural ways. I forced myself to look away, keeping my gaze fixed on the center of the room. The ticking grew louder, filling the air like the sound of footsteps, echoing around me, faster and faster. The shadows seemed to pulse with each tick, and that same unsettling whisper drifted through the room, low and indistinct, like a voice from far away. Then, the ticking stopped. Dead silence fell over the room, and my phone buzzed again, louder than before. The message was shorter this time, and somehow that made it worse. Do not let it see you move. Sit still. Do not breathe. I sat down on the floor, my back pressed against the wall, my breathing shallow. I forced myself to stay perfectly still, every muscle tense, straining against the urge to run. The silence was unbearable, thick and oppressive, like the whole house was holding its breath along with me. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from the far corner where I'd seen the shadow move. I kept my eyes down, resisting the urge to look, but I could feel it, that presence moving closer, each step deliberate, dragging across the floor. It moved in slow, jerky motions, pausing every few seconds as if waiting for me to make a mistake. The room grew colder, the air thick and stifling. I could hear the faint rustle of something dragging across the carpet, getting closer and closer. I clenched my jaw, trying not to even breathe, feeling my heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat. Finally, the noise stopped. I didn't dare look up, but I could sense it, hovering right in front of me, like it was leaning down, studying me. My skin prickled, and I fought the urge to flinch, to move even a fraction of an inch. I felt like I was being dissected, like whoever or whatever it was could see every fear, every weakness. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a quiet, satisfied sigh. And just like that, the presence was gone. My phone buzzed again, and I couldn't pick it up fast enough. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me a second to focus on the screen. You're doing well. One more task remains. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and waited for the instructions. This whole ordeal had started to feel like some twisted game, and I knew whatever was coming next would be the worst of it. My mind raced with questions. Who had sent these messages? How were they watching me? And most importantly, what would happen if I failed? The message finally came through. Return to the basement. There is something waiting for you. Face it! I wanted to scream. The basement was the last place I wanted to go, but I knew I had no choice. Somehow, I knew that if I didn't finish this, if I didn't follow every rule, something terrible would happen. I gripped my flashlight, hoping the batteries would hold out for a little longer, and made my way back to the basement door. The air was colder than before, thick with that same rotten metallic smell, like something had been rotting down there for ages. Each step creaked under my weight as I descended, and with every inch, the dread grew stronger, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, shining my flashlight around. Nothing had changed, except the envelope was gone. I looked around, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it, but then I heard a sound, a low, guttural whisper coming from somewhere in the darkness. I lifted my flashlight, and for a moment, I saw it. A face, pale and twisted, half hidden in the shadows, its eyes wide and empty, staring straight at me. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but somehow I understood. "You don't belong here." The light flickered, and the face disappeared, and then the basement door slammed shut. The slam of the door echoed through the basement, and my blood went ice cold. I scrambled up the stairs, hoping it hadn't locked itself, but as I reached the top, I found it firmly shut. I twisted the doorknob, pulling and shaking it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. In the suffocating dark, that same low whisper came again, crawling out of the shadows, wrapping around me like cold fingers. This time, it sounded closer, like it was right behind me. My flashlight flickered, its beam weak and sputtering, casting long, twitching shadows against the walls. I backed down the steps, realizing I had no choice but to wait. I hadn't been given any new instructions, no message on my phone. I was on my own now. I turned to face the basement, shining my fading flashlight over the room. My gaze fell on a door I hadn't noticed before, half hidden behind a stack of dusty boxes. It was small, almost too small for a person to fit through, and it looked ancient, the wood warped and cracked. Against every ounce of reason, I knew I was supposed to go in there. With each step closer to the door, the air seemed to grow thicker, like I was wading through something dark and suffocating. The smell was worse here, decay mixed with something almost sweet, like rotten fruit. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle. It felt cold, damp, like it had been sitting in a forgotten place for far too long. I pulled the door open, and it creaked, revealing a narrow, claustrophobic passageway that seemed to twist down further into the earth. A faint, eerie glow pulsed at the end, flickering like candlelight. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing down the narrow tunnel as I made my way towards the light. The walls were rough stone, damp to the touch, and carved with strange symbols, circles, triangles, shapes that seemed to twist and shift in the dim light, making my eyes ache if I stared too long. I was beginning to think this wasn't a basement anymore, but somewhere else entirely. The air felt heavy, dense, like it was charged with something ancient and hostile. As I moved deeper, the whispering started again, filling the space, echoing off the stone, each word bleeding into the next, until it was an unintelligible hum that made my skin crawl. Finally, I reached the end of the passageway. The faint glow was coming from a single candle on the floor, illuminating a small, circular room. In the center, there was a chair facing away from me, and on the chair sat a figure, slumped over, motionless. My stomach twisted as I stepped closer, half expecting the figure to jump up, to turn around with that same twisted face I'd seen before. But it remained still, unmoving, like it hadn't noticed me yet. I wanted to turn and run, but some twisted sense of curiosity kept me rooted in place. My phone buzzed. The screen was dim, barely legible, but the message was there, clear as day. Sit in the chair. Do not move until dawn. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. There was already someone in the chair. I hesitated, glancing back at the figure. Its head was tilted to one side, almost resting on its shoulder, and I could see now that it was bound to the chair with ropes, each one digging into its limbs, holding it in place. But as I looked closer, I noticed something even more disturbing. The figure looked like me. Same clothes, same hair, even the same old scuffed sneakers I was wearing. It was as if I was staring at a mirror, but one that was somehow wrong, twisted. The me in the chair was pale, almost gray, with sunken, hollow eyes that stared blankly into the darkness, as though it were trapped in some nightmare it couldn't escape. My mind reeled, and I stepped back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with voices that overlapped, rising into a chaotic crescendo. I clutched my head, trying to block it out, but the voices only grew louder, each one pressing into my skull, repeating the same thing over and over. Sit in the chair. Sit in the chair. Sit in the chair. I didn't want to, but it was like something was pulling me, an invisible force urging me forward. My feet felt heavy, like they were moving of their own accord, dragging me toward the chair. The closer I got, the colder the air became, biting into my skin, seeping into my bones. Finally, I found myself standing directly in front of the me in the chair, its head lowered to the side, its eyes empty and vacant. My hands shook as I reached out, half expecting to feel warm skin, a pulse, something to tell me this was just a sick prank. But when my fingers touched its shoulder, it felt cold, rigid, like stone. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced at the screen. Sit in the chair. I couldn't take it anymore. With a shaky breath, I pushed the figure out of the chair. It toppled to the floor with a dull thud, landing face down, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. I felt a wave of nausea as I lowered myself into the chair, gripping the armrests, forcing myself to keep still, just as the message had instructed. As soon as I sat down, the whispering stopped. Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. I felt a strange weight settle over me, like I was sinking, falling into the chair, my body growing heavier with each passing second. My limbs felt numb, and a deep, cold exhaustion seeped into my bones, making it hard to keep my eyes open. I glanced down, and that's when I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. My skin, my hands, were turning gray, the color slowly draining away, leaving me looking as lifeless as the figure that had been sitting here before me. My pulse quickened, and I tried to move, to stand up, but it was like the chair was holding me in place, pulling me deeper. The whispers returned, soft and taunting, echoing through the room. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, the air around me thickening, and in the dim candlelight, I saw shadows beginning to gather, swirling around me, pressing closer and closer. Then, my phone buzzed one last time. You've taken its place. Now, wait for the next challenger. The words barely registered before the candle flickered and went out, plunging the room into total darkness. The darkness settled over me, thick and impenetrable, like I'd been submerged in ink. My limbs were frozen, held down by some force that wasn't physical but felt as real as chains. My breathing was shallow, each exhale faint in the heavy silence. I was trapped, alone, sinking deeper into the chair that now felt more like a grave. I don't know how long I sat there, minutes, hours, maybe longer. My body was numb, my senses dulled, and the room felt like it was closing in, tightening around me. But as I sat in that abyss, I felt a presence shift within the room. It was subtle at first, just a change in the air, like a draft moving through stale space, carrying with it a faint sound, a footstep. Someone was here. A sliver of fear pierced through my numbness, reigniting some small spark of awareness. I strained to hear, forcing myself to listen beyond the blood rushing in my ears. The footsteps grew louder, cautious, each step slow and deliberate, like the person was as unsure of this place as I had been. The footsteps stopped, and I could sense the figure nearby, standing just out of sight. My mind raced, even though my body was helpless. I wanted to scream, to tell them to turn back, to run, but my lips wouldn't move, held shut, as if stitched together by an unseen force. Then, light flickered into the room, a weak beam from a flashlight, sweeping across the walls, bouncing off the shadows. For the first time, I could see the symbols etched into the stone around me, the strange, twisting shapes that looked like they were watching me back, writhing beneath the surface. The figure took another step forward, and in the dim light, I could make out the features of a young guy, maybe early 20s, wide-eyed and nervous, holding his flashlight with trembling hands. He looked exactly like I must have looked when I'd entered this room, confused and wary, but with that same reckless curiosity. He shone his flashlight over the floor, taking in the sight of the empty envelope, the bound figure that I had pushed aside to take my own place. His face twisted in horror when he saw it, the figure that looked disturbingly like him. And just like I had, he stepped back, glancing around as if hoping he'd just stumbled into the wrong room by accident. I watched him from the chair, feeling a chill run through me that was somehow worse than any fear I'd felt before. It was a chill of recognition, of understanding, and in that moment, I knew exactly what was about to happen. He was going to sit down. He was going to take my place, just like I had taken the place of the one before me. The guy's flashlight wavered as he hesitated, his hand brushing against his pocket, as if searching for his phone. The light reflected off his face, illuminating his expression, one that flickered between confusion, fear, and a kind of dark fascination. His phone buzzed, and he flinched, staring at the message that I already knew he was reading. Sit in the chair. Do not move until dawn. He looked down at the chair, the empty seat, his gaze lingering on me for a fraction of a second. Our eyes met, or they would have if he could have seen me, but he couldn't. To him, I was just another figure, hollow and still, trapped in place. He hesitated, but just like I had, he couldn't resist. He reached out a shaky hand, his fingers brushing against the cold wood of the armrest, and as he did, I felt a strange release. The pressure binding me loosened, just a fraction, like a heavy weight lifting ever so slightly from my shoulders. I wanted to warn him, to tell him to get out before he became part of this twisted cycle, but I was helpless, a prisoner in the shadows. He lowered himself into the chair, gripping the armrests, his breaths shallow as he stared into the darkness, waiting. and as he sat, I felt something begin to shift, a slow, inevitable pull, like a door creaking open. The numbness that had held me started to melt away, replaced by a sensation that was both freeing and terrifying. I was being released. The darkness around me began to pulse, growing darker, thicker, swallowing the light from his flashlight until only his face remained, illuminated in a faint, ghostly glow. His eyes were wide, darting around the room, and I knew he could feel it. The weight, the presence settling over him, locking him in place. I felt myself slipping back, falling into the shadows, as if the room itself was letting me go. My body was light, almost floating, and for the first time since I'd sat in that chair, I felt a strange kind of peace, like a release from a prison I hadn't known existed. And then, as I drifted further into the darkness, I heard the whisper again, clear and cold, echoing through the space around me, fading with each word. The chair must be filled. Always. I didn't understand what it meant, not fully, but some part of me realized that I was free now, free to leave, to return to the world above. But as I rose, I felt a trace of sadness, a haunting memory of what I'd endured, and a sense of foreboding for the new occupant in that cursed chair. He was trapped, just as I had been, and there was nothing I could do to save him. I drifted up, feeling the cold of the basement melt away as I moved toward a faint light, knowing that by the time dawn broke, someone would come for him. Last Halloween, I ordered a doll of the deep web. Last night, after 1 year, a half-naked woman showed at my porch and won't leave. Hey Reddit, this might be a long one, but please bear with me. I'm writing this at 3 a.m., and if I'm honest, I'm a little freaked out. It started last Halloween. I live alone in a quiet, boring neighborhood where Halloween night is about as wild as things get. The most intense thing I'd usually do is hand out candy to a few kids and then kick back with some horror movies. But last year, I got curious, or maybe just too bored for my own good. I'd heard about the deep web, the so-called hidden parts of the internet, where supposedly you could buy things you can't find on Amazon. I'd heard of mystery boxes, strange little trinkets, and well, yeah, some weirder stuff. So, naturally, being the genius I am, I decided to check it out. I wanted something creepy, a doll specifically. I didn't even know why I was so set on it. Maybe I wanted it to sit on my shelf, something spooky and unique to show my friends and say, yeah, I bought this off the deep web. You know, like a horror prop you don't expect to be anything more than that. After a couple hours of sketchy searching and clicking around in the deep web, I found this site. It had this bizarre but strangely minimalist setup. Everything on the screen was in grayscale, except for a single red button in the center that said, "Welcome to the Emporium." Honestly, it looked like something out of an old horror game. I knew I probably shouldn't click it, but there was this pull, like I had to. So I did. The page loaded with a list of strange items, each with little creepy descriptions. Oddly enough, each item only had one photo, usually in bad lighting, with no more details or price, just an order now button. And that's when I saw her. A doll, if you could call it that, appeared about halfway down the list. She looked antique, something that would have been at home, in a dusty old house, in some forgotten corner of a town no one visits. Her face had these tiny cracks all over it, as if she'd been dropped one too many times, and her eyes were completely black. No shine or gleam, just empty and staring. There was no hair, and her body was wrapped in what looked like old, tattered lace. Beneath the photo, in plain block letters, was her description. "She will know you." Looking back, that phrase probably should have sent me running for the hills, but I was too far in at that point. So I hit order now. There was no checkout page, no place to input your info, just a small box that said, "Enter your address." As soon as I did, the screen went blank and the order was confirmed. That's it. No confirmation email, no tracking number. It was like the order had just vanished. For about a week, I figured I'd just been scammed, that maybe this doll wasn't real, or it would never actually show up. And honestly, I felt a little relieved. But then, late one night, there was a knock at my door. Now, you'd think that'd be unsettling, but it was more annoying than anything else. I wasn't expecting any packages, and I'd been drifting off to sleep, so I ignored it. But the knock kept coming, like whoever it was didn't plan on stopping until I answered. When I opened the door, no one was there. Instead, a small beat-up cardboard box sat on my porch, with no address, no shipping label, no return info. Just my name written in black marker on top. It was a chillier night, but there were no signs of anyone nearby. No neighbors out, no cars driving past. Just the box and the dead silence of my porch. I took it inside, and as I held it, I felt this strange heat coming from it. Not just came from the mail truck, warm. This was more like I'd just picked up a fresh baked loaf of bread. Curiosity won out, and I opened it right there on my kitchen counter, half expecting it to be a dumb prank. But there she was, the doll, exactly as she looked in the photo. Her cracked porcelain face, empty black eyes, and that ragged lace dress. I swear, for a second, her eyes looked like they flickered, like a spark had jumped in them. I brushed it off as my imagination and placed her on the top shelf of my bookcase, thinking that was that. She'd just be a creepy little decoration. I might even get a few good stories out of it. For the next few weeks, nothing happened. Halloween came and went, and the doll just sat there. I'd almost forgotten about her until one night I was watching a movie and my TV glitched out. The screen went black, and for a second, it felt like the whole room got colder. I brushed it off as a power thing and went to bed. The next morning, I found the doll lying on the floor. She was facing my bedroom door, her eyes still black and hollow, staring directly at where I'd been sleeping. I swear, it felt like she had moved herself. I mean, I knew logically that wasn't possible. Maybe I had just put her too close to the edge of the shelf, or maybe I had bumped it without noticing. But the thing was, nothing else had fallen. Not the books, not the little trinkets or candles I'd set up around her. Just the doll, lying on the floor, staring at me with those dark, empty eyes. I laughed it off, trying to ignore the chill that had crept up my spine. I put her back on the shelf, dead center this time, made sure she was steady, and went on with my day. For a while, everything was fine, but every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye. It was like she was watching me, just barely in my peripheral vision, and each time I turned to look at her straight on, she'd just be there, in her spot, perfectly still. A few days later, I came home late from work. My apartment was pitch dark, and as I fumbled for the light switch, something didn't feel right. You know that feeling when you can just sense something's off, like the air's a little thicker. Yeah, that. I finally flicked the light on, and there, right in the center of my coffee table, was the doll. I know I hadn't left her there. It wasn't even like I might have put her there and forgotten. She belonged on the shelf. That was her spot. I would have noticed if I'd moved her myself. But somehow, she'd gone from my shelf across the room to my coffee table in the middle of my living room. I stood there, just staring at her, half expecting her to move right then and there. The silence in my apartment felt heavy, like there was someone else there with me, holding their breath. I slowly picked her up, her cracked face and cold, smooth porcelain skin giving me the creeps all over again, and I took her back to the shelf. This time, I put her in a box, tucked her away behind some old books. Out of sight, out of mind, right? Except it didn't help. For the next week, I'd come home every night to find her somewhere else. One night, she was on my kitchen counter. Another, she was sitting at the foot of my bed. I even found her in my bathroom once, perched on the sink like she'd been waiting for me. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I was starting to feel like she was following me, moving when I wasn't looking. One night, I'd had enough. I was already sleep-deprived and stressed out, and seeing her sitting on my dresser, facing my bed, was the last straw. I picked her up and shoved her into a plastic bag, double-tied it, and threw her in the dumpster outside my apartment complex. I actually felt a little relieved as I watched the lid slam shut. Finally, I thought, that would be the end of it. But that night, I woke up to a noise. It was soft at first, like tapping. I thought it was coming from the window, like tree branches brushing up against the glass. But the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from inside my apartment. My heart started racing as I followed the sound to the living room. There, right in the middle of the coffee table, was the plastic bag I'd dumped the doll in. I could still see the tied-up knots I'd made, still tight and secure. But somehow, she'd found her way back. At this point, I was too freaked out to even touch her. I left her there, shoved some furniture in front of my bedroom door, and forced myself to go to sleep. I kept telling myself that I'd deal with her in the morning, that maybe this was all some elaborate prank, that someone was messing with me. But deep down, I knew nobody else had a key to my place, and I'd seen her with my own eyes. She wasn't supposed to be there. I'd thrown her away. The next day, I tried calling a friend to come over, just so I wouldn't be alone with the doll. But my friend, James, wasn't picking up, and honestly, I didn't feel like explaining the whole thing over text. I was afraid he'd think I was crazy. By the time the sun went down, I'd managed to ignore her, leaving her in that plastic bag on the coffee table. I figured maybe if I ignored her, she'd somehow just disappear. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept looking at my door, waiting, almost expecting something to come through. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, the same tapping noise, but this time it was louder, more deliberate. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I slowly made my way into the living room, expecting to see the doll in some new spot, maybe lying on the floor again, or sitting on the couch. But she wasn't there. The tapping continued, and it was coming from my front door. I stood there in the dark, my flashlight shaking as I pointed it at the front door. The tapping was steady, almost rhythmic, like someone lightly rapping their knuckles against the wood, waiting to be let in. I thought about ignoring it, about going back to bed and pretending I hadn't heard a thing, but I couldn't shake this gut feeling. Something was telling me I needed to look. I held my breath and tiptoed to the door, my footsteps nearly silent against the carpet. Slowly, I peered through the peephole, and for a second, I thought I was seeing things. Outside, illuminated by the porch light, stood a woman. She was barely dressed, her hair messy and tangled, her skin pale under the dim light. She looked like she'd been out there for hours, just waiting. But what really got me, what made my blood turn to ice, was her expression. She was smiling. Not the kind of friendly smile you'd expect from someone asking for help, but a vacant, twisted grin, like her face had been forced into that expression. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, dark as empty wells. She didn't look right. She looked like a mannequin someone had tossed in the dumpster, only to have her crawl out and find her way to my door. Then she leaned forward, her hand lifting to tap the door again, right at eye level, as if she knew I was watching. Her nails were cracked and dirty, tapping the wood with that same eerie, deliberate rhythm. I stumbled back, barely managing to keep myself from making any noise. The hairs on my neck were standing up, and my hands were clammy as I fumbled to lock the deadbolt. But as I twisted it, the tapping stopped. I froze, too scared to even breathe, and just waited, listening. Then came a whisper, soft and muffled through the door. "Let me in." It wasn't a question, not a request. It was a demand. Her voice was strange, almost childlike, but hollow, like someone mimicking a human voice, without knowing how it should sound. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking, and did the only thing I could think of. I called the police. The operator's voice was calm and professional as I told her what was happening. I tried to explain that there was a woman outside my door, acting wrong. I didn't even know how to describe her. Every word felt like it wasn't enough. The operator assured me that they were sending someone over and told me to stay on the line. But as I waited, that whisper came again, louder this time. "Let me in." I couldn't help it. I looked back through the peephole. She was still there, but now her face was even closer, pressed right up against the door, her eye nearly touching the glass. Her smile was wider, stretched too far, her lips pulling back to reveal teeth that were just a little too sharp, too uneven. "Please," she whispered, her voice almost pleading now. "You ordered me, didn't you?" My heart skipped a beat, and the phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the floor. I hadn't told anyone about the doll, not even the operator, but somehow, this woman, this thing on my porch, knew. I backed away from the door, trying to convince myself that this was all some twisted dream, that I'd wake up and laugh about it later. Then, as if she could sense my thoughts, her whisper came again, her tone taunting. "You asked for me." I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the door. Eventually, I heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. Relief washed over me, and I nearly collapsed with it. I expected her to leave, to disappear the moment help was on the way, but she stayed put, still pressed against the door, her eye unblinking. The sirens grew closer, until finally, red and blue lights flashed outside. I didn't dare open the door, but I looked through the peephole, just in time to see the woman stepping back, her head tilting as she watched the cop car pull up. She didn't look afraid or even surprised. She just looked amused. The officer got out, his flashlight sweeping across my porch until it landed on her. For a second, he looked just as confused as I felt. He called out to her, but she didn't respond. She just kept smiling, her head cocked to one side, as if she was enjoying a private joke. Finally, the officer stepped forward, reaching out to put a hand on her shoulder, but she took a step back, and then, without a word, She turned and walked off into the dark, her bare feet silent against the pavement. I watched as the officer tried to follow her, but she moved quickly, disappearing around the corner. By the time he circled back to my apartment, she was gone, vanished into the night like she'd never been there at all. The officer knocked on my door and I opened it, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. I tried to explain what had happened, but he just gave me this skeptical look. He told me that she was likely just some vagrant, maybe a little high or out of it, that she'd probably wandered off to some other poor soul's doorstep. But as he turned to leave, he paused, glancing over his shoulder. "She left something," he said, pointing to the ground just outside my door. I looked down, and there, right on my doormat, was the doll. I couldn't believe it. She was back. Not the woman, the doll. The same cracked face, those hollow black eyes staring up at me, somehow looking even darker in the glow of my porch light. The officer must have noticed my reaction because he gave me this puzzled look, like he couldn't understand why I was so shaken. I don't think he could see what I saw in her, the sheer wrongness that radiated from her tiny, broken form. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, and I nodded, muttering something about being fine, just startled. I couldn't explain the real reason, the truth of it, that this wasn't just a weird woman or a random trespasser. This felt personal, like she'd come back for me. After the officer left, I took the doll back inside, feeling like I didn't really have a choice. I didn't want to leave her outside, where anyone could see her, or worse, where she might find her way back to my door. So I brought her in and set her on the kitchen counter, grabbing a chair and sinking into it, too exhausted to think straight. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at her, as if she might spring to life at any moment. Hours must have passed, because eventually, I found myself blinking awake in the kitchen. I hadn't even realized I'd fallen asleep, but the sun was just starting to rise, casting a dull gray light over the room. For a second, I almost convinced myself that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe the woman had just been a bad dream, and I'd never actually seen her. But then I saw her. She was still on my porch, not moving, not tapping, just standing there, staring through the glass with that same horrible frozen smile. And that's when I realized she wasn't just staring. She was holding something. My stomach dropped as I recognized what it was. An old, crumpled piece of paper. Slowly, she lifted it up, pressing it flat against the glass so I could read it. It was a photo of me. Not a recent one, but one from years ago, from some old high school event. A picture I hadn't seen in ages. I had no idea how she'd gotten it, but it was me, smiling awkwardly in a group photo, oblivious to whoever had been lurking behind the lens. Her eyes met mine, and she tilted her head as if to say, "I've known you for a long time." I stumbled back, my heart pounding, as I tried to understand what I was seeing. I knew I had to get rid of her, the doll, all of it. I couldn't live like this, with her watching me, her presence lingering in every shadow and corner of my apartment. I decided to take the doll as far away as I could. I didn't care where I ended up, as long as it was nowhere near here. So I grabbed a backpack, stuffed the doll inside, and headed for my car. I drove and drove, not really sure where I was going, but I kept going until I reached the outskirts of town, an old bridge over a wide, murky river. I parked, feeling like I was in a trance, and took the doll out of my bag. She felt heavier than before, like she'd absorbed every ounce of fear I'd had over the past few weeks. dragging me down with her. With one last glance, I hurled her over the edge, watching her sink into the water, her pale, cracked face disappearing beneath the ripples. It was like a weight had been lifted. I felt my heart slow down, my breathing return to normal. For the first time in weeks, I actually believed it was over. But as I turned back to my car, something caught my eye. On the other side of the bridge, standing on the shore, was the woman. She was staring straight at me, her smile even wider, her teeth glinting in the dim morning light. And then she did something I'll never forget. She waved, a slow, mocking wave, as if she were saying goodbye. Or maybe, see you soon. I bolted to my car, heart pounding, fumbling with the keys as I tried to get the engine started. When I finally looked up, she was gone. The river was still, as if nothing had happened, as if I had never even been there. I drove home, trying to convince myself that I was done with this, that she was gone for good. But when I got back, as I opened my front door, I nearly collapsed. There, sitting on the floor of my living room, dripping wet, was the doll. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at her soaked, ruined dress, leaving a small puddle on my floor. My mind was racing, trying to piece together something, anything that made sense. But no matter how many ways I tried to logic my way out, one fact stared back at me. The doll was back. She'd returned, soaked with the same river water I'd watched her sink into. She looked even worse now, if that was even possible. Her cracked face was chipped in new places, the lace dress torn and blackened by the muddy water. But the eyes, those empty black pits, were the same, and they were staring straight at me, like she'd been waiting for me to come home. I took a step back, too afraid to even blink, and that's when I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, filling the room with an icy shiver. You can't leave me. It wasn't just the whisper that freaked me out. It was that the voice was coming from inside my head, like she was planting the words directly into my mind, bypassing sound altogether. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. Her words echoed, bouncing around inside my skull, growing louder and louder until it felt like my head was about to split open. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I opened my eyes and she was gone. The doll was no longer on the floor where she'd been moments before. There was no puddle, no trace that she'd ever been there at all. I stumbled around my apartment, searching every corner, every shadow, convinced she was hiding somewhere, waiting to appear when I least expected it. But there was nothing. Somehow, the doll had vanished, without a trace. For the next few days, I tried to go back to normal. I went to work, went through the motions, but every shadow, every strange sound made me jump. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. It was like she'd imprinted herself into my brain, her presence lingering like a ghost I couldn't shake. Even when I wasn't looking at her, I could feel her, lurking somewhere just out of sight. One night, I woke up to a familiar sound, the soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from my bedroom closet this time, quiet but persistent, like a heartbeat. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I couldn't hear, but my body moved on its own, drawn to the sound. I crept to the closet, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. When I opened the door, I didn't see her at first. There was nothing there, just a pile of my clothes, some old boxes. But as I looked closer, I saw her. Her cracked porcelain face was peeking out from beneath a pile of my shirts, her black eyes gleaming in the darkness like she'd been waiting for me to find her. I stumbled back, my hand shaking, and she whispered again, "You can't leave me. You ordered me." And that's when it hit me. She wasn't just a doll. She was something more, something that had attached herself to me the moment I'd clicked that Order Now button on the deep web. Somehow, she'd been bound to me, like she was fulfilling some twisted contract I'd unwittingly agreed to. I knew I had to end it, and there was only one way to break whatever bond she'd created. I grabbed her from the closet, her tiny body cold and rigid in my hands, and headed for the fireplace. I tossed her into the flames, watching as the fire began to lick at her dress, the lace catching fire in seconds. As she burned, I heard that voice, one last time, faint and furious, echoing inside my head. "I'll be back. I'll find you." The flames flared, and then, with a final hiss, she was gone. Nothing but ashes and charred fragments, no trace of her left. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace, a feeling that I was finally free. But that was last Halloween. Tonight, as I'm sitting here writing this, I can hear something outside, a soft, familiar tapping at my door. I bought a haunted doll from the dark web as a Halloween prank. Now it's calling me Mom. Alright, so before I dive into this, I want to clarify a couple of things. I'm not someone who scares easily. I'm the type of person who'll watch horror movies alone in the dark, just for the thrill. My friends joke that I'm dead inside, which, yeah, maybe. But that just makes everything I'm about to say even weirder. I need you guys to tell me if I'm losing it, or if this is actually as messed up as it feels. It all started about 3 weeks ago. My friends and I were planning a Halloween party, and they decided to go all out with the theme, Haunted House meets urban legends come to life. So, naturally, we all took up different horror tasks. One friend was in charge of setting up a creepy basement seance scene. Another was handling the fog machines and fake blood. And me, I was supposed to get something authentically creepy. They dared me to find an actual haunted object. Now here's the thing. I've heard about haunted dolls and supposedly cursed items floating around on eBay or whatever, but honestly, I wanted something more legit. I don't know. I thought it'd add a little edge, a thrill for the party. And after some light digging, which quickly turned into hours of obsession, I found myself exploring the deeper corners of the internet. Yep, the dark web. Don't ask how I got there. Curiosity and a couple of YouTube tutorials were all it took. It didn't take long to find listings for haunted and possessed objects. Way more than I expected, honestly. There were weird descriptions like cursed antique doll, previous owners reported scratching sounds, or mirror from 1800s asylum, shows you things that aren't there. But the one that stood out was this super old porcelain doll. The listing was blunt and to the point. Doll from estate sale. Previous owners reported doll behaving unusually, believed to be haunted. No returns. The photo was grainy and didn't help with the vibe at all. The doll was small, maybe about a foot tall, with a cracked porcelain face, faded blue eyes, and dirty blonde curls that looked like they hadn't been touched since the 1800s. Her dress was this dingy, lacy white, stained and torn in places, like something straight out of a horror movie. Perfect for the prank, right? I sent the seller some cryptocurrency, because of course, it was crypto only, and figured I'd just wait a week or two. Worst case, I figured I'd lose the money and have to find something else. But nope. 2 days later, I came home to a small, nondescript box on my doorstep. No return address, no shipping label, nothing to even tell me where it came from. Just a plain cardboard box with my name on it. I wasn't expecting anything, so I already had this weird feeling in my stomach. You know, like that uneasy kind of feeling. But hey, I wanted a haunted doll for Halloween, and here it was. I carried it inside, placed it on the coffee table, and I swear, as soon as I opened the box, this awful, musty smell hit me. Imagine an old basement or like a neglected attic, that kind of smell. The doll was just wrong somehow, even in person. Its eyes were this dull, faded blue that almost looked gray in the dim light of my living room, and they seemed to stare right through me. I laughed it off, took a couple of pics to send to the group chat, and joked, "Look what I got for the party. Hope she doesn't murder us in our sleep." They laughed it off too, but that weird feeling didn't go away. Then, things started happening that night. Nothing crazy, but enough that I noticed. Around 2 a.m., I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard this faint whispering. It was almost like the soft rustle of fabric, like someone was lightly dragging their hand across my bedroom wall. I thought maybe I'd left a window open, but everything was shut tight. It wasn't enough to freak me out, but it was enough to make me pause, you know. The next morning, I woke up and found the doll sitting in the hallway. Now, I'm a deep sleeper, but I know I left that thing on the coffee table the night before. But there it was, just sitting in the middle of the hallway, perfectly upright. I convinced myself that I'd somehow put it there and just forgot. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe I wanted to mess with my roommate subconsciously. I don't know. Things got weirder over the next few days. Every night, I'd hear those soft whispers and rustling noises, always around 2 a.m., always just quiet enough that I couldn't make out what it was. And every morning, I find the doll in a new spot around the house, once in the kitchen, then by my bedroom door, and at one point, directly in front of the bathroom mirror. Each time, I tried brushing it off as me being scatterbrained, or maybe even sleepwalking. But the whispers, those were different. A few nights ago, I decided to record it. I left my phone recording while I slept, thinking maybe I'd catch a stray sound or two, and prove to myself that it was just my imagination. When I played back the recording the next morning though, my blood went cold. Around 2:03 a.m., right after the usual rustling, there was a voice, faint but clear enough that I couldn't mistake it for anything else. It was a soft, childlike whisper, and it said one word, "Mom." Now, I don't have kids. I don't even have young nieces or nephews. There's no way anyone in my apartment could have said that. I didn't sleep at all the night after I heard the recording. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that single word, "Mom." There was something about the way it sounded. It wasn't just a voice. It had a strange weight to it, almost like it was trying to reach me, like a hand stretching through the dark. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever said that word was right there in the room with me. The next day, I had this huge pit in my stomach as I walked into the living room, half expecting the doll to have moved again. Sure enough, it was sitting at the edge of the couch, facing the hallway, its dull eyes staring at the door like it was waiting for me. I didn't even want to touch it, but I forced myself to pick it up and stuff it back in the box it came in. I told myself it was just for peace of mind. If I kept it out of sight, maybe this whole thing would stop. It didn't. That night, I shoved the box into the back of a storage closet, under some heavy blankets, and double-checked that the door was shut. I turned on every light in the house, just trying to make myself feel less vulnerable, I guess. But as soon as I lay down, I started hearing it again. This time, it was louder. Not just a whisper, but more like faint footsteps, like someone pacing slowly in the hallway outside my bedroom. I pulled the covers up to my chin, lying there like a terrified kid. My mind was racing, trying to come up with some rational explanation. I thought maybe my roommate was home early, or I was hearing the pipes. But the footsteps had a rhythm, a distinct sound like tiny deliberate steps. Then it stopped. The silence stretched on, thick and unnatural, pressing down on the room like a weight. I held my breath, listening. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it was over, that maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Then, just as I was about to relax, I heard it again. "Mom." This time, it was louder, closer, and this time, I knew exactly where it was coming from. It was outside my bedroom door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the faint line of light under the door, expecting to see shadows shifting at any second. But nothing happened. Just that heavy, deafening silence pressing down, like the whole room was holding its breath. Finally, after what felt like hours, I mustered the courage to get out of bed. I tiptoed to the door, carefully cracked it open, and peered into the hallway. Empty. But as I glanced down the hall toward the storage closet, my blood went cold. The closet door was open. Just a few inches, but it was definitely open. And lying there on the floor, right outside the closet, was the doll, sprawled on its side as if it had been thrown. I wanted to bolt out of the apartment right then and there, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I stared at the doll, half expecting it to move, to sit up or reach out, but it just lay there, lifeless, its faded eyes staring off into the dark. Finally, I grabbed a trash bag from the kitchen, went over, and shoved the doll inside. I twisted the bag tight and threw it into the trash can outside, slamming the lid shut. I felt this sick sense of relief, like I'd finally gotten rid of it. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The same soft, childlike voice. Only this time, it sounded disappointed, sad almost. And instead of just one word, it whispered something new. "Why did you leave me?" I sat up, heart pounding, staring into the darkness. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I felt like a prisoner in my own room, listening as the voice faded into silence. I barely slept the rest of the night, half expecting to hear it again, but it never came. The next morning, I went outside, planning to take the whole trash can to the dump. But when I lifted the lid, my stomach dropped. The bag was gone. Not torn, not scattered, just gone, as if someone had taken it. My first thought was that maybe a raccoon or some stray dog had gotten into the trash, but there was no mess, no sign of anything. I looked around, trying to convince myself I just misplaced it somehow, but deep down, I knew better. I knew what was missing, and I knew it wasn't coming back. When I went back inside, I found the doll sitting on my kitchen counter, positioned perfectly upright, with its hands folded in its lap. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at it. This was beyond anything I could explain. I hadn't touched it. No one else could have gotten into my apartment. And yet, there it was, looking somehow smug. That's when I noticed something new. Her dress, that grimy, lacy thing, had a fresh stain across the collar, a dark, reddish-brown smudge. dried and flaky, like old blood. And even worse, there was a faint metallic smell in the air, like rust or something left out in the rain for too long. As I backed away, fighting the urge to throw up, I heard that same childlike voice, but now it was right next to me, barely a whisper. "Don't leave me again, Mom." I don't think I even blinked for a full minute. That voice, it was right there, as if someone was leaning over my shoulder, whispering directly into my ear. My skin prickled with that electric kind of fear, the kind that makes you feel like your whole body's buzzing. I just stood there, staring at the doll, not even daring to turn around, terrified that if I did, I'd find something watching me. Eventually, I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and bolted out of the apartment. I had no plan. I just needed to get out of there. I ended up at a coffee shop a few blocks away, slumped in a corner booth, frantically Googling anything I could about haunted dolls, dark web horror stories, even urban legends, anything to make sense of what was happening. I must have looked insane, sitting there with bags under my eyes, scrolling through horror forums like a conspiracy theorist. But I didn't care. I needed to know if anyone else had dealt with something like this. A few pages into a random forum, I found an old thread titled, "Bought a doll from the deep web. Now I can't get rid of it." The details were disturbingly similar. The poster described how they'd bought a doll as a joke, thinking it was just a spooky gimmick, but things escalated fast. The doll moved on its own, showing up in random places, and it would speak, just like mine. The kicker, the poster said that every time they tried to get rid of it, it would come back, angrier each time. They'd eventually tossed it into a river, and while they hadn't seen it since, they still heard whispers at night. I sat there, reading and rereading that post, feeling like I'd stumbled onto some curse that I was now part of. There was a comment below the thread with one piece of advice that stuck out. It was written by a user with some cryptic name, no profile picture, and a single post history. All they wrote was, "It wants something. Give it what it wants, or it'll take it." That line stayed with me, and I felt this awful sinking feeling settle in. What did it want? Money? Some weird kind of ritual? I laughed it off at first, convincing myself it was just a prank comment, until my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a text from an unknown number. "Mom, why did you leave me?" I dropped my phone so fast, it hit the edge of the table and clattered to the floor. My heart was racing, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, but I forced myself to pick it up. My hands were shaking as I read the message over and over, that one word, "Mom," feeling heavier every time I looked at it. My mind started racing, trying to figure out how anyone could have gotten my number. I didn't give out my personal info on the dark web, and I hadn't even put my phone number on the delivery form. As far as I knew, there was no way anyone could know who I was, unless this thing was real, unless there was something else at play. I decided to head back to my apartment, if only to confront this thing head on. It was probably a terrible idea, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to face it, or it would haunt me forever. I took my time walking back, half hoping that when I got there, the doll would be gone, that maybe I'd find my apartment empty and everything would just reset. But as I pushed open the door, I froze. The doll wasn't on the counter where I'd left it. It was sitting on my bed, perfectly centered on the pillow, facing the door, its dull eyes fixed directly at me. And in its lap was my phone. The screen lit up, with a new message from the same unknown number. "I need you, Mom." I stepped back, hand instinctively covering my mouth as I took in the scene. There was something almost deliberate about how it was positioned, like it wanted me to see it, like it was staging this for my benefit. That's when I noticed another new detail, a faint trail of dirt smudged along the edges of its dress and feet, as if it had been dragged through mud or something worse. And right there on the pillowcase were tiny dark footprints. The logical part of me wanted to believe this was all a prank, that somehow my friends had found a way to pull this off. But deep down, I knew it wasn't them. No one had access to my apartment, and I'd locked everything before I left. No, this was something else. I approached the doll, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. As I got closer, the smell hit me again, that awful, metallic, musty odor, stronger now, almost suffocating. I hesitated, fighting the instinct to run, but forced myself to grab my phone off its lap. The screen immediately lit up with another text notification. "Why won't you hold me, Mom?" I couldn't breathe. I turned around, backing away from the bed, trying to keep my eyes on the doll, while my brain scrambled for an escape plan. I couldn't keep this thing in my apartment any longer. But if throwing it out wouldn't work, then what could I do? In a panic, I grabbed a box of matches from my kitchen drawer, determined to end this once and for all. I didn't care about the risks anymore. I'd burn the whole thing, if that's what it took. I shoved the doll into the bathtub, dumped some rubbing alcohol on it, and struck a match. As the flames started to rise, licking at the doll's dress and charring its porcelain face, a horrible, high-pitched scream filled the bathroom, echoing off the walls. It was a sound I'll never forget, a shrill, desperate wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it cut right through, piercing and relentless. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the dying flames. I opened my eyes, half expecting the doll to be gone, but it was still there, now nothing more than a blackened husk, its features melted and twisted into something almost unrecognizable. I exhaled, relief washing over me. It was finally over. Or so I thought. As I stared down at the charred remains, my phone buzzed one last time. My heart sank as I glanced at the screen. Another message from the unknown number. "You can't burn family, Mom." I could barely hold my phone. My hands felt like ice, shaking so badly I thought I might drop it. That one word, family, hit me like a punch to the chest. I don't know why, but something about it made everything feel so much worse. This wasn't just some haunted doll from the dark web anymore. This felt personal, like something had latched onto me in a way I couldn't escape. The smell of burned fabric and scorched porcelain hung thick in the air, and as much as I wanted to just leave, to walk away from this nightmare, I couldn't stop myself from looking back into the tub. The doll was still there, charred and misshapen, barely recognizable. The face was cracked, twisted into a melted, grotesque grin, almost mocking me. But the worst part, the eyes, they were somehow untouched, staring up at me through the blackened face. That same cold, faded blue, now brighter, like they'd been cleaned by the fire. I backed out of the bathroom, unable to look away until I was out of the room. I locked the door behind me, as if that flimsy lock could keep whatever was in there out. I needed help, needed answers, but I was too embarrassed to call anyone. I could imagine the conversation. "Hey, I bought a haunted doll on the dark web. and now it's calling me Mom. Also, I tried to burn it, and it's still staring at me. No one would believe me, and honestly, I wasn't even sure I believed myself. I spent the night on the couch, every light in the house on, clutching my phone in case another message came through. But the hours dragged by, and there was only silence, thick and suffocating, as if the whole apartment was holding its breath. I told myself the worst was over, that I'd burned it, that it was just a freaky leftover doll, and nothing more. But just as dawn broke, I heard it, a scraping sound, soft and rhythmic, coming from the hallway outside the bathroom. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy along the floor. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping it was my imagination, but the noise didn't stop. If anything, it got louder, closer. Finally, I forced myself to sit up, my heart pounding in my ears, and peered down the hall. And there it was, the doll. It was sitting upright, right in the center of the hallway facing me. The charred, blackened dress was torn and singed, with patches of melted fabric hanging off like cobwebs. Its face was cracked and burned, the mouth twisted into that horrible grin. But the eyes, those awful, piercing blue eyes were locked onto mine. I could hardly breathe. I kept telling myself to run, to grab my keys and leave, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, completely trapped by those eyes. And then, as I stared in horror, it tilted its head, just slightly, like it was curious, studying me. I heard that voice again, faint but somehow louder than before, like it was inside my head. Mom, don't you love me? I felt a chill run through my entire body. It wasn't just calling me Mom anymore. It was asking, like it expected an answer. My throat went dry, and I tried to swallow, tried to come up with something to say, but my voice was gone. All I could do was shake my head, barely managing to whisper, "No, you're not. You're not my child." The doll's head straightened, and for a second, I thought I saw its mouth twitch. The grin seemed to widen, stretching the cracks along its porcelain face. Then it whispered again, softer this time. "I'll make you love me." Those words hit me like ice water, jolting me out of my frozen state. I grabbed my phone and dialed the only person I could think of who might understand, my grandmother. She's this no-nonsense type, always talking about spirits and energies and how the world's got layers we can't see. Growing up, she'd tell us stories of haunted places and strange encounters, and while I used to think she was just being dramatic, right now she felt like my only hope. When she picked up, I could barely get the words out. She must have heard the panic in my voice, because she told me to calm down and just explain everything, step by step. So I did. I told her about the dark web, the doll, the whispers, the messages, everything. She didn't even sound surprised. In fact, she was almost angry. "You bought something like that online, and you brought it into your home." Her voice was tense. "That's not just a doll, you know. It's a vessel. Something's attached to it, and now it's attached to you." She told me I needed to get rid of it, and this time, not by burning it. Whatever's in there, it's clinging to you, because it thinks it can manipulate you. It wants something from you, and until you break that connection, it'll keep coming back. Break the connection? How? My voice was shaking. "I've tried everything. I threw it out. I even burned it." But she cut me off. "You need to bury it," she said, her tone deadly serious. "Find a place far away from your home. Bury it in the ground, cover it with salt, and leave it. But you have to make it clear that you're letting it go. Tell it you're not its mother, that you don't belong to it, and that it has to move on. If you don't, it'll keep following you. I didn't have any other options. The thought of carrying that thing somewhere in my car made my skin crawl, but I'd do anything to get rid of it at this point. I grabbed an old shoebox, some duct tape, and wearing gloves, I wrapped the doll as tightly as I could, trying not to look into those horrible eyes. I drove out to the edge of town, past the old, abandoned farmland where no one would come looking. As I got out of the car, holding the shoebox at arm's length, I could swear I felt something shift inside, almost like it was moving. With my hands shaking, I dug a hole as fast as I could, glancing around every few seconds to make sure I was alone. I sprinkled salt into the hole, just like my grandmother said, and placed the box inside. But as I started to cover it, I heard it again. "Mom, don't leave me." It was softer this time, almost pleading, and for a moment I hesitated. There was a tiny sick part of me that felt sorry for it, like maybe it did need me. But I forced that thought down and finished burying it, packing the dirt tightly and covering the spot with more salt. I whispered, as firmly as I could, "You are not my child. I am not your mother. Leave me alone." I stood there, heart pounding, waiting, half expecting to hear that voice one last time. But there was only silence. The drive home was eerie, the kind of silence that hangs thick, pressing in on you, making every small sound feel like a scream. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see the doll sitting there, watching me with that cracked, burned face and those cold blue eyes. But it was gone. I'd buried it. I'd done everything my grandmother told me to do. It was over. At least, that's what I kept telling myself as I pulled into my driveway. The apartment felt strange when I walked in, like it was holding its breath. I went room to room, turning on lights, checking every closet and corner, as if the doll might somehow be lurking, even though I knew it couldn't be. I ended up in the bathroom, staring at the empty bathtub, still covered in black smudges from the fire. It almost felt like a scar on the apartment itself, a reminder of everything that had happened. I told myself I'd clean it in the morning, that it was time to move on. That night, I slept with my bedroom door open, needing to see the hallway from my bed. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. But the hours passed, and nothing happened. I finally fell asleep, exhausted, sinking into that deep kind of sleep that almost feels like relief. When I woke up, the sun was shining, streaming in through the windows, making everything feel lighter, almost normal. I got up, stretched, and felt this incredible wave of relief, like I'd finally escaped something heavy and dark. I went about my morning, made some coffee, even started cleaning the bathroom, scrubbing away the black stains left behind. It was like I was erasing the last traces of the nightmare. But as I was finishing up, my phone buzzed on the counter. I froze, staring at it, dread crawling back over me. Slowly, I reached for it, telling myself it was probably just a spam text or a friend checking in. But when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. It was another text from the unknown number. "Mom, why did you leave me again?" I could barely breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly hold the phone, staring at that single line, that awful word, "Mom." The room suddenly felt colder, the sunlight seeming to dim, shadows stretching across the walls. Then, as I stood there, the silence in the apartment broke. A soft scraping sound, like something being dragged along the floor, echoed down the hallway, growing louder, coming from the front door. I forced myself to move, every step feeling like I was sinking into quicksand, but I couldn't ignore it. The scraping sound stopped just as I reached the door. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and slowly opened it, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. There, sitting on the doorstep, was the doll. Its porcelain face was even more shattered than before, deep cracks running from the forehead down to its chin, like a broken mask, barely holding together. But those blue eyes were the same, bright and cold, staring up at me with an intensity that felt almost alive. The dress was torn and dirty, the fabric stiff with dried mud, and something darker, something that looked like old blood. I backed up, slamming the door, pressing my hands against it as if that would keep it out. My mind was racing, grasping for any solution, anything that would let me escape this thing once and for all. Then I remembered something my grandmother had said. It thinks it can manipulate you. It wants something from you. I turned around, trying to calm my breathing, to think clearly. If it wanted something, then maybe I could end this by giving it what it wanted. Maybe it needed some kind of closure, something that would make it leave me alone. I opened the door again, finding the doll still there, staring up at me with that horrible, expectant look. I don't know what you want from me, I whispered, my voice trembling. But I'm not your mom. I never was. You don't belong here, not with me. For a moment, nothing happened. I stood there staring at it, waiting. Then, just as I was about to close the door, I saw something that made my heart stop. A tear, a single, tiny tear of what looked like thick, dark liquid slid down the doll's cracked face, catching the light as it dripped down to the porch. I could hardly believe it, but the sadness in those glassy eyes, the silent, pleading look, it felt real, almost human. I don't know why, but I felt a sudden, intense wave of pity, like whatever was in that doll, whatever spirit or force or energy was attached to it, was lost, trapped in a loop of wanting, needing, searching for something it couldn't find. As much as it terrified me, I felt this small, strange urge to help it. I knew it sounded crazy, but somehow I felt like I owed it some kind of answer. I'm sorry, I whispered, feeling the weight of my words. I'm sorry you lost whoever you're looking for, but I'm not her, and I can't be what you need. You have to let go. The doll seemed to sit there, unmoving, the single tear now dried, leaving a dark stain on its cracked cheek. Then, almost imperceptibly, it seemed to nod, a slow, reluctant tilt of the head. I blinked, not sure if I'd imagined it, but when I looked again, the doll was still. I took a deep breath and gently, carefully, lifted it from the porch, carrying it one last time. I drove back to the spot where I'd buried it, feeling strangely calm. This time, I didn't dig a hole. I didn't bury it, or try to salt it or burn it. I simply placed it down on the ground, right under an old tree, and left it there, saying one last time, goodbye. As I drove away, I felt the weight lift. For the first time in weeks, the silence felt peaceful, not heavy or foreboding. When I got back to my apartment, I half expected to see it waiting there, like it had somehow found its way back. But the rooms were empty, filled only with sunlight and the faint hum of normal life. It's been a few days since then, and I haven't heard anything. No whispers, no texts, no footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes, I still catch myself glancing at the front door, expecting to see that familiar face waiting for me. But it's never there. Maybe it finally understood. Maybe it finally found whatever it was looking for. Or maybe it just moved on to someone else, some other poor soul who thought they could handle a harmless Halloween prank. All I know is that I'll never look at dolls or the dark web the same way again.